Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Infuse Your Future podcast, where we bring together people and ideas who are doing great things in the world. Today, we have a really fun conversation with Clarissa from the ParenTween Connection, and I think you're going to love it. This is the first time I'm dividing the episode into two parts, just to make it a little bit shorter, but definitely both parts are super valuable, and I hope you listen to both. So without further ado, let's talk with Clarissa from the ParenTween Connection. Hey, everybody, I'd love to welcome our guest for today and have her tell you all about what she does. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. Thanks so much for having me, by the way, Carla. And hello to everyone who's listening. My name is Clarissa Constantine, and I am the founder of the ParenTween Connection. The way I describe who we are and what we do is that we are where parents go when they don't know where to go to find support for themselves and for their kiddos.
That sounds amazing. I have a couple
Thank you.
teenagers myself. I would assume you have teenagers or did?
Interestingly, I don't. My husband and I have not gone down the route of having children. But we were the children. We were the ones who, like, I had a rough go with my mom. She passed almost 4 years ago now. We just had a tough relationship. We did not maintain our connection during my teenage and young adult and not so young adult years. And my husband, who is also a teen mentor, had a whole host of challenges as a kid, including a couple of suicide attempts by the time that he had hit high school. And still navigates mental health challenges as a result of the experiences he had as a kiddo. So between our professional experiences, I've actually been an SAT and ACT coach for 25 years. But so between both of our professional and personal experiences, helping families strengthen connection within the family, but then also find the professionals who can help them, is near and dear to our hearts because of our own personal experiences. But no human children. If you count my fur babies, that's a different conversation.
Well, it can be kind of a big struggle to connect with your teen, especially post-COVID.
Yes.
In my opinion, especially the boys. And I know me as a parent, I really cherish my kids and want to have a good connection with them. And, sometimes it's hard navigating that connection parenting line where you want to connect, but you got to give them some hard truths and how to keep them engaged and not hating life at the same time.
Well, and also holding boundaries, right? Like one of the things that I observe is, and I think this is where my mom and I struggled, is, when the kiddos are younger, mom, dad, whoever the parental units are in the family, it is their responsibility to make sure that kiddos stay safe, right? It is mom and dad's responsibility. And I say mom and dad speaking in heteronormative terms because it's an easy phrase, but I do want to clarify whatever that family structure is, it is the adult's responsibility, to keep the kid from running out in traffic, to keep the kid from touching the stove, to dictate when we go to the kinder music and the playtime at the gymnasium or whatever, right? Like that's the role of the adult, is to organize and dictate what happens, right? We have this gradual shift during elementary school where that changes a little bit, that by the time we hit middle school, often, again, broadly speaking, trying to be a dictator and an authoritarian is going to be one of the quickest ways to cut that connection, because that at that age range, once they hit like 7, 8 years old, instead of going from constantly asking why about the world around us, they start identifying or exploring, who am I? And so part of that is like they have to separate from the adults in their lives and trying to be the autocrat and not and recognizing that you can't control, but holy cow, can you influence? That can be a tough adjustment for some parents. And I guess that I think that's where my mom and I struggled, is that, well, even into my adult years, she was still trying to control and tell me what I had to do. And I was like, I am 25 years old. I don't need you reminding me to brush my teeth at night. You know what I mean? Like those kinds of things. Like, I think she just struggled to switch into recognizing how much influence she could have as opposed to control. And influence is, I think, a whole lot more impactful in the long run.
Yeah, I agree.
So, so a lot, like I said, a lot of what drives me and the work that we do at ParenTween Connection is based around what I call the foundations of connection. And I think we can bring these in even as the adults in the village, that we continue to hold those boundaries. Like we just had a conversation in our group the other day about cell phones. I was like, all right, how old was your kiddo? I shared an article about cell phones and cell phone usage among teenagers. And I was like, how old were your kiddos when you got cell phones? And what are the rules that surround cell phones? Like, society has to have rules to operate on. Red light means stop or people die, right? Like, and so it's still important that we maintain those rules and maintain consequences, but that doesn't mean that we can't connect with them along the way. And so the foundations of connection, and by the way, these are on our website. If anybody wants to download them and like hang it on the refrigerator or the mirror in the bathroom or whatever, you can do that. But the letters of connection spell out each of these concepts. And I'm actually curious, Carla, as I share them with you, I'd love to know one or two, maybe three that hit you the most as a parent, but also as a professional. So here they go. The C is create a safe place, observe, non-judgment, nod and smile, as in zip it. Because trust me, teenagers don't want to hear what you have to say, parents. Right? Like you're laughing, but that's the case, right?
I do know that's the case.
So nod and smile. Explore is the E. Challenge your truths or curiosity. Take your time. Innovate. Own your own story. And nurture.
Wow.
So as you process those, I'll give a little backstory. The way that these came up, I was actually at a business training where the primary speaker was saying, come up with like a 5-letter word or a 7-letter word that you can turn into an acronym for something. So in typical ADHD overachiever style, I chose a 10-letter word. But then I was like, okay, at that time I was maybe 20 years into my career coaching college bound high school kids, and you'd be amazed at some of the conversations that we have, intermittently interspersed around triangles and grammar and whatnot. But I asked myself, what is it that I bring to the situation that makes it comfortable for students to talk with me about things that they're not ready yet or may never be ready to talk about with their parents? And so it was literally a conversation with myself where I was like, self, what do you do? And so this is kind of how I came up with these, because I'm not the parent, but yet I am part of the village. And so it's like, what are the things that I do bring, but also what are the things that I don't bring to the situation? So we'll explore a little more of that as we go, but I'm curious, which of those like popped out and smacked you in the proverbial head?
I love them all, but innovate was the biggest one.
Uh-huh.
I feel like you do have to be super innovative with the teenagers, at
Sure.
least with mine.
Uh-huh. And
Uh,
how old are yours right now,
they're
you
both
said?
very different. They're 14 and 16,
Okay.
both very, very different. So I have to be very innovative and very creative with how I
Mm-hmm.
interact with each one.
Mm-hmm.
Non-judgment is a big one. I really try to practice it. It's hard,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
practice it with myself, practice it with my kids.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when I see the judgment being used by others,
Mm-hmm.
it just reminds me to stay focused on that for myself. I
Right.
really have to back off and not judge my kids. There are so many paths in the world, so many paths to success. And if you try to keep a kid on a path that they don't want to be on, it does more damage than good.
It certainly can. Yeah, absolutely.
So trying to keep that attitude of non-judgment while also trying to at least, you know, help him find a path,
Sure.
you know.
Sure.
Um, and I guess nurture would be the third. I
Uh-huh.
mean, they're all great. I could pick them all.
Right.
trying to figure out, creative ways to nurture their independence, nurture their love of learning, because I feel like our kids have to love learning because they're going to be lifelong learners. The
Sure.
world is changing so fast.
Hmm.
I feel like there's no way to predict what's going to be in the world when they have kids and how they're going to have to
100%.
parent when they have teenagers. Because just think
Hmm.
of the changes that have occurred in the last 20 years.
Oh, goodness.
So
Yes.
in 20 or 30 years when they have teenagers, I mean, it's impossible to predict.
Absolutely. So you made a couple of thoughts or made a couple of comments that I wanted to piggyback on. Um, you mentioned the non-judgment for self. And I do want to interject as I continue to develop my thoughts around these foundations. I am continuously reminding myself that these are not just the foundations of connection with your teenagers or the teens and tweens in your life. These can be the foundations in your workplace. These can be the foundations in your house of worship, if that's part of your world. These can be the foundations in your partnership. I'm going to pause for a second because I have to sneeze. It's gone. Okay. These can also be the foundations of connection if you have a belief in a higher power, a God, universe, spirit concept. These can apply there. They can also apply in your relationship with yourself. I think a lot of us don't acknowledge that we have relationships with ourselves. And how can I not judge myself? Some of us treat ourselves so poorly. Some of us speak to ourselves so poorly, to your point of the non judgment. Like, I would never say to somebody else some of the things that I've said to myself over the years, ever. And so I really have done work to reframe that and be like, hey, would I say that to somebody that I loved? Would I say that to one of my closest friends? Would I say that to my husband? Would I say that to my father? Would I say that to my child if I had one? And if the answer is no, then why do I think it's okay to say it to myself? Why do I treat myself that way? So I did want to comment on that because as you're listening, wherever anybody listening, wherever you feel like there's a weak connection, listen to these and go, hey, not only like which one stands out to me because I feel like it's one of the most valuable as you've identified, but also to the listeners, I encourage you to think about the ones that you initially go, oh, I don't need to worry about that. Oh, that's crap. Or, oh, whatever. Yeah, that's not a thing. Because if you're willing to gloss over it, maybe it really is fine. But maybe it's that you're wanting to avoid it. And maybe it does actually need a little bit of attention from you.
That's deep.
Yeah. Every now and again, I come up with some really profound stuff, and then other times I'm like, I don't know how I tied my shoes today. So so as we go through these, the other thing I really want to emphasize to listeners is these are not linear. These are kind of like the ball of yarn that the cat got to. They're not even necessarily a spiral where you hit them in, consecutive order and then circle back around. Like thinking about creating a safe place can lead to non-judgment, can lead to exploration, can then lead to owning your own story, but then can come back to, oh, but I have to observe in order to own my own story. So know that there is no rhyme or reason. The only organizational pattern is that the letters spell connection. So my thinking is it makes sense to go through some of these and to kind of share some of my thoughts and have conversations around each of them. So when we talk about creating a safe space or a safe place, a lot of folks think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which if folks aren't familiar with, it's a triangle created by a psychologist eons ago that basically establishes fundamentally we need like air, we need water, and we need food. And then we need hopefully a roof over our heads and a safe place where we're not being subjected to unkindnesses or abuses, right? And then we kind of move up the ladder from there. I'm going to hopefully lay the foundation that we're living in homes where there is safety, like physical safety. But the reality is that that's not always a fair assumption to make, because oftentimes when there is some aspect of physical abuse going on, kids aren't open about it because the perpetrator lives in their home. And as you know, for many victims in that situation, they can't say anything because they don't have anywhere else to go.
Right.
But beyond that, one of the most important things that I think we can do as the adults in the village in terms of creating a safe place is think about how our actions and words impact folks emotionally. You know, there's an old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's crap. Because
I
why we
agree. I'm
recognize,
so glad you brought that up because I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was gonna mention, when you were talking about the physical abuse, to me, it's the emotional and the mental abuse that's even worse because there's no markings. It can be very subtle and it can lead to much longer damage.
Mhm. And it's um not only can it be more subtle, but it doesn't leave the outward identifiers. You know, if somebody is physically abusive, we can see bruises, we can see a black eye or markings or something like that, but we can't see the actual inner bruising, as it were. I think of it like, with an apple. If you take an apple and you toss it on the ground, it may not splat, it may still look okay on the outside, but then when you actually cut it, you see that it's bruised on the inside, and we can't actually see that with the emotional, or like with the impact that words can make. One of the things that I like to think, or I like to reference, is the acronym THINK when I choose to say something. And the acronym THINK stands for, is what I'm about to say true, helpful, inspiring, necessary, or kind, or and kind? And if it's missing one of those, I like to take a step back and go, okay, does it really need to be said?
I love all your acronyms. They're
they
great.
work they work in my brain. That one is not an original, I have to acknowledge. I borrowed it from somebody else out there. If you Google, think, or before you speak, think, it'll come up for you. Um, the other thought process that I like to consider is, and this comes up certainly in a marital situation as well, not only with your kids, but the circumstance, like whatever you're about to say, or whatever you're upset about, that you're about to redirect back at the other person about, is this situation going to matter in 5 minutes, 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months, or 5 years? If the answer is no, then it probably isn't necessary to say. Now, I'm not saying don't advocate for yourself. I am not saying don't speak your mind. I'm just saying we need to be cognizant of what we say and how we say it, because that's the other aspect. The words that we use, if you look at any research about communication, the words that we use only comprise 7% of the message. Our tone and our body language comprise 93% of the communication that's actually happening. So, as much as I'm loath to acknowledge that my mother was right all those years ago, when she said to me, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. Well, that goes for the adults too. And I think sometimes we can fall into a pattern of like, but I'm the adult, so I can speak however I please. And the reality is that in doing that, we can cause damage.
Right.
The
Yeah, we can say and do whatever we want, but there are consequences for that.
uh-huh.
And do you want to have a good connection or a bad connection?
Well, and that's exactly what ended up happening with my mom. My mother was very much a like, I'm the mother, I know best. Children should be seen and not heard. And it totally caused disconnection between us. The other thing that I look back at, and I saw it not only in my mom, but in so many families, it speaks to the non-judgment that you mentioned earlier. So clearly, I'm going out of order as well, but these two are very tightly related. When we talk about judgment or non-judgment, I want to ask listeners, how glad were you when the last election was over? Regardless of what the outcome was, whether it was your candidate or not, and for some of us, neither candidate was our candidate, right?
So
Okay.
true.
But how thankful were you when it was over? Because the nastiness wasn't in our faces. The mudslinging, the slander, like the things that people say, like I was just like, I need the negativity to stop. Can we just please put Mickey Mouse in the president's seat? Because I swear he'd do better than anyone else. But anyway, like he's at least not going to be a jerk in the process, I would like to think anyway. You know, but part of it is that if you voted for Trump, you were a bleepity bleepity bleep. Or if you voted for Biden, you were a bloppity bloppity blop, right? We were judging people based on what circle they filled in on one piece of paper every 4 years. And
Right.
the
You only
human
have two
brain,
choices. You either
right,
choose X or Y, or you don't vote. So it's
right,
not like you have a large choice.
right. It's not like there's many paths that we can choose in that case, right? But the mudslinging about, well, if same thing with the vaccines and the pandemic. Well, if you're an anti-vaxxer, then you're this, that, or the other thing. And if you were the first one in line to for a vaccine, then you're the other, and the other thing, right? There was such judgment, such nastiness. How many families got broken apart based on a vaccine? Now, again, I'm not going to tell anyone what they should or shouldn't believe in that case. I'm just stating that families were broken up as a result of it,
Yeah,
right?
lost connection.
That disconnection, you got it. Now, I get that we have our beliefs, but one of the things that came up actually in a workshop that I hosted with one of our professionals in our Trusted Expert Network last week is the difference between accepting something and agreeing with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the biggest aspects of non-judgment is that we can accept something even if we don't agree with it. And I think we tend to use those two terms synonymously. I don't accept that you're a lesbian or that you're gay or that you're transsexual or that you're not going to college or that you don't want to be the doctor that I, as your parent, have always dreamed you would be, whatever it is. No, I may not agree with your choice, but that doesn't mean that I can't accept you for who you are. And that's, again, from my observations, I think that's really hard for some parents because the parents have this idea of what their kid will and should be. And when it turns out that kiddo doesn't fall into that box of expectations, as it were, it can be really challenging for parents.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also challenging because I feel like a lot of faith systems, their whole faith system is based on judgment. And so that's what people are used to doing. They're judging. And
Correct.
I feel like, I don't know if these are, excuse me, new or old concepts, but the both and versus the either or, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like older philosophies are it's black and white.
Correct.
Either it is or it isn't. You're good or you're bad. It's true or it's
Sinner, not
false.
sinner, going to heaven,
And
going to hell.
the truth is, life is not black and white.
Correct.
Life is colorful. And so you can have a both and.
Right.
You can both disagree with someone and see that they're a valuable person who deserves love, respect, and uh,
Kindness.
rights. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Correct. And I agree with you that there are definitely belief systems where that's the case. I was raised in one of those myself, and I think my father was horrified that when I shared with him after my mother's passing that had the circumstance arisen that I became pregnant before I was married, I honestly would have sooner had an abortion than tell my mother. Not because I'm pro or anti-abortion, but because I was that afraid of telling my mother as an adult.
Wow.
Right? That's how much connection that we lost. And that's a huge part of why I'm driven to have these conversations with families and be like, look, you don't have to go through this. I know my mother loved me. I loved my mom, but we couldn't connect. We lost a lot of years and a lot of time together as a result of that. And it doesn't have to happen that way. So create a safe space, clearly connected to non-judgment. I want to cycle back to observing. You've heard me say, here's my observation. You know the old saying, there's three sides to every story, yours, mine, and the truth?
Yeah.
Right? That's because no single one way of looking things is absolutely true 100% of the time. You'll even have, go ahead.
Sorry. One of my favorite memes is they have the number 6 drawn on the ground and one person standing at each end. And one is insisting it's a 6 and one is insisting it's a 9. But they're both right.
Correct.
From one viewpoint, it's a 6. From the other, it's a 9.
And they're both right.
They're both right.
Both totally right. With the, hey, we have different perspectives. Again, this goes to the accept versus agree. They're very closely linked. One of the things that I have found is when you're in the heat of the moment and you're stressed, when we become dysregulated ourselves, it's really easy for teenagers who, by the way, the frontal lobes of their brain, that part right behind their forehead, that does not develop physiologically. It is not fully developed until they are at least 25 years old. Okay. They may look like full-fledged adults on the outside, like your daughter may be developing breasts and hips widening, and your young men, have broader chests and facial hair and whatnot. Their brains lag way behind. So number one, keep that in mind. But when they're dysregulated and then we become dysregulated with them, all hell breaks loose. So what I have found can be effective when we're in those circumstances, even with with our peers with fully formed frontal lobes, is not to respond in the moment, but to observe patterns of behavior and then come back to the person when I am more regulated. Because then I'm able, what's that?
Sorry, that was great advice.
Well, we're going to get a whole lot further. So as an example, I was open. My husband has navigated some mental health issues, as have I. And we both thankfully have done a ton of our own work and recognize what the other's triggers are. And instead of constantly being all breathing down each other's necks, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay? Why aren't you telling me what's going on? I'll ask like, hey babe, you doing okay? And he'll be like, yeah, I'm all right. But then I know what to watch for at this point because I have a pattern of behavior with him. I can tell when he hasn't been sleeping well. I can tell when when he's been drinking more than maybe is healthy, or when he hasn't been eating well, or I can tell when he hasn't been exercising. And so when I can come back to it later and be like, hey babe, I've noticed for the last 3 nights that you had an extra drink each evening. Or, wow, babe, for the last week, you've been sleeping a lot later in the mornings. Is everything okay? That way, when I address it, it's not necessarily like, dude, what are you doing having that extra drink? Like, you shouldn't be having that. Or, get your butt out of bed. What are you, you lazy, miserable bag of potatoes? That's going to be offensive. But if I can come at it and say, this is what I've observed. Are you okay? What are you feeling? Then it's matter of fact. It's just like, this is what I've seen. Not like, dude, you're being such a jerk. And the same thing goes engaging with teenagers. Here's the pattern of behavior that I've seen, or here's the symptoms that I'm noticing. Is everything okay? I noticed that you've been really quiet the last few days. Is something going on at school? Or I noticed you haven't talked about Sam the last few days. Are you guys still talking? Did something happen? Did you have an argument? If you can come at it from observation, then it's less affrontive and it's less perceived as an attack and more like, here's what I've seen. I'm noticing this pattern. How can I help you? Tends to come off better in human relationships than in your face does.
Yeah, I
So
agree. And also
just some thoughts.
the just having a curiosity approach and asking a
Correct.
question rather than just
Hmm.
assuming.
Absolutely.
Because someone
Absolutely.
who even is not okay, if you come at them the wrong angle, they're going to dig in, even though they know they're not
Hmm.
okay and maybe want to talk about it, but they're going to refuse to
Hmm.
because of the angle that it was
Hmm.
approached.
Absolutely. Well, and so that actually is a really good tie-in to the next N, which is nod and smile. Now, I half jokingly, half seriously said earlier, like, let's be real, kids don't want to hear from the adults in their lives. But it's because they don't. They are identifying who they are and trying to figure out what they believe. So, as infuriating as this advice is going to be, and I know it is, when you ask a question, the one recommendation I'd like to offer you is to count to 30 before you say anything else. And it is agonizing. Agonizing. 30 seconds, friends. Okay. But remember, their frontal lobe is not fully developed yet. The frontal lobe is where higher level thinking happens biologically, like physiologically. It is where executive function happens. Oh, and by the way, speaking of executive function, if you have a kiddo with ADHD in your world, their executive function slash maturity level can lag behind their chronological age by as much as a third. So if you have a 15-year-old, 16-year-old with
16.
ADHD, their executive function capacity at times is the equivalent of a 10 or 11-year-old. It's not that they're trying to be jerks most of the time. Maybe sometimes they really are trying to push buttons. I'm not going to say that that's not the case. But sometimes they genuinely can't function in the same way that their peers do any more than you can expect a paraplegic to run a marathon. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying no, that that's the case. But part of what that means is you've got to give them the space to process. And what happens when we're dysregulated and all up in our kids' craws about stuff? What were you thinking? Why did you do this? Give me an answer. You look at me when I'm talking to you right now, right here, right now, right here. Pay attention to me. And
Oh
they're all
my
like, oh
gosh.
my God, everything is offline. My entire brain has just like fizzled out. And they shut down, right?
I would imagine most adults would do the same thing if their bosses came
Correct.
and acted like that to that with them.
Correct. Yep. Yep. Oh, and yet we still want them to feel like they can come talk to us when they need help. We just put them into a situation where their brains went offline and yet we're supposed to be the safe place. Like that's not helpful. So keep in mind, again, we have to address it when we're regulated. It's our job as the adults to set the model of how to engage with them. So we need to keep ourselves regulated. It is totally fair to be like, you know what? I am too triggered right now. I need to walk away and come back to this conversation. That's fine. That is fantastic modeling of how to handle conflict as long as you come back to it. You can't just walk away and leave it,
Good point. Good point.
right? But then we go into exploring. This is also part of like, as you're chatting with them, do everything you can not to give your advice. Ask them, like when they say something, as soon as they start talking, start counting to 30 again. And when they say something that you can ask a question about, ask the question. Let's dig into this a little bit. So let's take an example. Hey, you haven't talked about Sam lately. Is everything okay? Let's say Sam is a platonic friend. You haven't talked about Sam lately. Yeah, we had an argument. Oh, that must feel really awful. What was the argument about? Can I ask? Right? Not just what was the argument about, but then you're inviting them like to give you permission even to ask. And then if they're like, you know what, mom, I don't want to talk about it, be like, that's okay. But if that changes, I'd love to know if and when you're ready. That way you're at least opening the door that they can chat with you about it. But then maybe 2 days later, you make a point and go, hey, how are you feeling about things with Sam right now? Is like, are you feeling a little bit better? What's going on? Don't push about what the argument was about, but hey, tell me more. When you're ready, I'd love to know more about what happened. Because then that also gives them, it takes the pressure off that they have to respond now. And that, a little bit later, maybe they can come back to you and be like, hey, mom, you know what? I appreciate earlier that you didn't really push me on talking about what happened with Sam, but can I get your perspective on something? Again, it opens the door. They've got to be ready to do it on their time. But so exploring, asking open-ended questions, not just yes or no's, is really important. But then also for us as the adults, to your point earlier, Carla, like technology is one example of how things are going to be so very different for our generation's grandchildren than they are for our generation's children. We're also having a lot of conversations that weren't things when we were kids, especially around the world of sexuality, gender identity. We're also seeing a lot more of a turn away from college applications. The VOTEC non-4-year option is becoming a lot more appealing to a lot of families. So that exploration is like, go look at other options, see what else is out there, both independently and with your teenager. Sit down next to them and watch, like if they're on YouTube on their phone, be like, hey, what you watching? Can I join you? And just like look over their shoulder. I do this with my best friend's kids all the time. I have no freaking clue what they're talking about half the time. But the fact is, I'm at least trying to show that I'm interested and that I want to see and that I'm interested in what they have going on. I don't remember any of the videos they've shown me. I'm not going to lie. But I know that they know that I cared enough to ask, or I'll be able to be like, hey, that dude who does like these silly tricks on YouTube, what was his name again? Or like, I'll be, deliberately silly about how I ask the 12-year-old something. And he always laughs at me because he knows I'm just silly. But again, we're building that connection by me going back and being like, oh, who is that guy you watch on YouTube? It's just part of the exploration process.
Very true. One of the things I love about my daughter is she constantly sends us TikTok videos.
Uh-huh.
So I make sure to watch them and respond to them so that she knows I'm watching them.
Sure. Do you find TikTok videos that you send to her?
Not so much TikTok because I'm just not on it, but when I find memes that I like, I'll send them to her.
Mm-hmm. So I imagine that there are many parents in that space because our generation doesn't necessarily spend as much time on TikTok as we spend like on Facebook, for example. But that is a way, if you spent 5 minutes a day looking at TikTok going, I want to find one video to send my kid. Oh, this made me think of you. Maybe it's like, a mom talking about how much she loves her daughter, or maybe it's something that your kid is interested in or whatever. Like 5 minutes a day is really easy to invest. I mean, when you're laying in bed at night, if you haven't put your phone away, or when you're sitting on the throne, or whatever the case is, right? Like make it, if you made an intentional effort of like, oh, let me meet her where she's at. It's easy. It could be something that a parent or an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent could choose to participate in a way to meet them where they're at. Those little things add up. What a great way to explore your truth and get curious.
Right, right.
Love it.
And I do give
Speaking
them a
of,
lot of
okay,
space. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I do give them a lot of space. My daughter definitely doesn't like to talk after soccer or after school. So I'll ask her how her day is. I don't want to talk. So I just
Okay.
leave her the space. She doesn't have to talk.
Is she a hugger?
Not so much. My
Okay.
son is the hugger.
Okay. So I would say, like, for a kiddo who isn't necessarily one who likes to verbalize a lot, if I mean, we know that physiologically hugs do good.
I'll usually
Maybe,
ask her sometimes. I'm like, hey, can I give you a hug?
yeah. Here's
She likes to talk and snuggle at 11 or 12 p.m. So I have to make sure I stay up that late so that I can be available when she's ready to talk.
absolutely. An interesting flip on the can I give you a hug? I do this with my husband all the time when I can tell he's in a mood. Hey, babe, can I have a hug?
Good one.
Because it's the same thing. It's the same effect. We've got arms around each other, which is the physiological bonding aspect of things, right? But that way, he doesn't perceive it as me doing something for him, or that he's the one being needy, or that I'm concerned about him and wanting to take care of him. It's, I could really use a hug right now. Can I have a hug?
I love that one. I'm going to start using it.
Cool. It's amazing how we can just make little tweaks on perspective that I think can make a big difference overall, you know?
Mm-hmm. Hey, everybody, I really hope you enjoyed that episode about connecting with your teen. Remember, that's just part one. Don't forget to listen to part two. And please share this episode with at least 2 other people so we can really get connection growing. Thanks, and see you next time. Bye.